disastrous.
They all had in common a great capacity to listen, and that goes together with some, of course, technical knowledge and expertise, but it's more the human element. What they were bringing on the table, I think, was 80% their being a human being, and of course, the knowledge that they had. These are very strong personalities, right? But they have this capacity of making their ego fade away. So that creates an incredible space where things can get harmonized, because they are creating the space, but they're not occupying the space, if that makes sense.
This is Elizabeth McNaughton, and welcome to Disrupting Disasters, conversations with disaster experts about how we can do disasters differently. This episode, I spoke with Marco. He is the Chief of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction for Asia and the Pacific, based in Bangkok. I wanted to speak with him because when you talk to him, it feels like the whole world walks into the room and we just have such great chats. And I wanted you to be in on that. We covered so much in this episode. Things like when he was in the hot seat at the table during 2015 when several big global agreements were negotiated, like the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We talk about what narcissism has to do with disasters and how investing in disaster risk reduction fundamentally supports human rights, and a whole lot more. You're in for a treat. Let's get into it. Oh, this is just such a joy. I've been looking forward to this conversation for ages. Just some background, like how did you find yourself in the whole DRR world and the diplomacy world? How did you come to be doing what you're doing?
At the university, I was studying human rights with an amazing professor. It was the first one, in fact, in Italy to start a human rights program. And he was very visionary and inspiring and super humble person. And he basically was the gateway for me to learn more about the United Nations. And then, of course, the people around me. At that time where I was studying law and human rights. And it was basically hard at the beginning, because when I was telling my friends that this is what I wanted to do, what is that? Because a lot of my friends were engineers and very concrete stuff.
Yeah, and I think many of our listeners will be the same. Like, what actually happens in the UN? What is it like to work on disaster diplomacy or to work for the UN?
I think to work for the UN is a great privilege and opportunity. It puts you in touch with so many different type of people, professions, experts, communities, nations. So the variety you are exposed to in and of itself is a great source of learning, inspirations, enriching. It's also an interesting mirror for yourself, who you are, who you're not. And getting to know you better, getting to accept yourself as well for what you are and what you are not. And this is more of a personal note. But then on the professional element is how you work with diversity to create opportunities for cooperation, for collaborations, identifying where and when certain skills that a partner may have can be helpful to someone else. And the diversity in the Asia-Pacific region is really spectacular. I think that there is such a huge potential for cooperation. There is a lot, but there is much more, I believe, that can be leveraged. So my daily work, if I'm in the office, is working with the team and seeing how we can define projects and proposal to partners. And then when you travel, is actually discussing those, learning how things can be adjusted. And most fundamentally, how can you bring different constituencies together in support of the work of countries? And by countries, I mean both governments, but also other civil society organizations, local community, private sector, scientists, and the list goes on. So it is about mobilizing really capacities for resilience and disaster risk reduction. I think that in my work in the UN, I work in different fields, refugees, human rights, rule of law. this is the area where I've seen the fastest progress. What are the drivers of risk? How the experts would call it intersectionality plays out, how different type of characteristics and vulnerability plays out to create a situation of risk. So you're always on the learning edge, and that's why you need so many different experts in co-creating this picture, and then how to work with that picture in terms of what type of concrete measures we need to take in order to reduce disaster risk and minimize the impact of disasters when risk cannot be reduced to zero, and mobilize also the financing for that, of course, because without investment, things don't move.
Yeah. I'm just thinking so many of the words that you have said, diversity, cooperation, collaboration, partnership, bringing people together, learning, that just so important for where our world is at today. And we're living in a more distrustful world, maybe. And so all of your experiences, I think, are so, so important right now. And I was thinking about the Sendai Framework. You were in the hot seat there and had a very much a front row seat. How did that feel? And how did you work to get an agreement? Yeah, and because that whole thing is how you negotiate, that is opaque to most people. So what is it like? What happens? What have you learned about that?
Yeah, that was probably one of the most amazing experiences that I had. I was not expecting it to be. I have to be very frank and honest.
And it's frightening to me how to bring all of those people together for agreement in a short time. How did that happen?
I think that 2015 was probably a very particular year because we had 4 major agreements that were reached. Chronologically speaking, it was the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is now the fundamental agreement we have international to work for resilience of people, community, and nations, disaster prevention. Then you had the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was on financing for development. That was in July. And then in September, we had in New York the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And then later in the year, we had the Paris Agreement. And it was interesting to see and learn from diplomats and other partners how they would navigate those 4 different negotiating tables. Because whereas the agreements were reached in different times along the year, in reality, the negotiation had started earlier. So there were almost 4 parallel tracks going on. And it was interesting to see how the delegations were very careful in saying something on one table because it would have consequences on other tables as well. I was very privileged to serve that process, and we worked with really amazing diplomats. And I came out of that process with 2 big things. One was the renewed conviction that international cooperation is really a must. It gave me a lot of motivations, a lot of insights. And the other thing is really the power of the collective in the sense that when you see the first draft that was the basis of the negotiations and what came out of it was much better. In that seemingly crazy process, something happened that transformed things for the better in a big way. And it was not really controlled. It was negotiated. So there was a strong leadership exercise by chairs, the diplomats chairing the process. But it was really the collective wisdom that emerged in the different delegations and the different stakeholders. And that for me was amazing, in the sense that sometimes you enter into processes that you don't really understand fully. You cannot control them fully. And because of that, more creative elements can come out. So you need to trust the process. Yeah? It's not always like this. I recognize that. But that was my direct experience. And having worked for refugees in the past, and there is a National Refugee Convention. So when I was part of this negotiating process, the understanding that these instruments, in fact, can be helpful to make a difference for people on the ground gave me the energy also to stay with that process, because even if in that moment discussing a word or a comma may seem like strange or useless, in reality, when you take a step back, you have something happening that maybe someone in the future can use to make a difference. You need to distance yourself from the process, looking at the bigger picture, longer time frames, and then understanding that there is a wisdom emerging out of these collectives, even if you can't see it at the beginning.
Yeah. Wow. And because I remember I delivered some chocolates to the New Zealand delegation. It was like going to, I don't know, 2 or 4 in the morning or something, and you're getting down to those commas and it's, come on, guys, we can get there from the background. How do you work with those parties when it is 2 in the morning and it has come down to a comma to help them in those last moments believe they can get there, trust they can get there, and keep hanging in there, keep at the table?
Yeah, what is making these things happen is really a strong sense of goodwill that prevails. Because it's true that it's easy to get lost in the process in and of itself. But the fact also that the last part of the negotiations happened during the World Conference in Sendai, Japan, with a great leadership also exercised by Japan as a host, but also by Thailand, because it was one of the 2 co-chairs together with Finland. So the diplomatic leadership was very powerful. But then outside of the negotiating room, there was a huge conference with many stakeholders organizing events, discussions. So this was very inspiring. And I heard many times delegates leaving the room and coming back and saying, look, out there is the real world and the real discussions. Here we are holding the pen. We really need to write down something that is going to help the challenges that they are describing, but also capturing the good lessons and insights and advice that they are putting on the table during these different events. So I think that dynamic between stakeholders discussions, events, sharing of ideas and practices and so on, and the negotiation at the same time was an interesting combination.
Create some energy.
Yeah, and great people, really. Such a large movement of, if I can call them like goodwill people, overcoming differences and putting common sense on the table.
And that great diplomatic leadership, what does it take to be a great diplomatic leader, do you think?
I work with different diplomats. I was very lucky to work with amazing people. Some of them were in disaster risk reduction, some others were in peacemaking and conflict. But I think that they all had in common a great capacity to listen, a great capacity to contain things and diversities, and selfless, very humble. Of course, an incredible capacity of simplifying and synthesize. And that goes together with some, of course, technical knowledge and expertise, but it's more the human element. What they were bringing on the table, I think, was 80% there being a human being with these skills. And, of course, the knowledge that they had. But this capacity of empathy, understanding, really reading between the lines, simplifying, synthesizing, and always being outside of the picture. Their egos, they are not getting into the, but of course, these are very strong personalities, right? But they have this capacity of making their ego fade away. So that creates an incredible space where things can get harmonized, because they are creating the space, but they're not occupying the space, if that makes any sense.
It absolutely does. And the moments that I have seen that in action, I've thought this is an art. Often developed over many years. I'm in awe of it, actually. I really am. I loved how you just used that word harmonised. And I just love you to chat about that a little bit. Is that not the thing we most need in our world at the minute? Harmony, harmonizers. Yeah.
Yes. When I started studying a bit more in depth the UN Charter, I was really, I don't want to sound too nerdy, but I was really impressed by Article 1 of the UN Charter, which is the one that defines the purpose of the United Nations. The Article 1 has 4 different elements, 4 different paragraphs. And the first 3 are about doing something. So they are about preventing conflicts, securing peace. They're about international cooperation. They're about solving problems of economic and social nature. They're about equality amongst nations and protection of human rights. So it's about doing things. But then there is the 4th one, which for me was very strange, which was about being. Because it says the UN is to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations to achieve, and I'm paraphrasing, the 3 other above. So that has always made me feel like, what does it take to be a center for harmonizing? Because it's not a center of harmony, it's a center of harmonizing. So you have to imagine a field where different forces are at play and how you contribute to make those forces make sense and creating synergies and focused action to achieve and try to solve the challenges that you have at hand. And yesterday was the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And even there is an amazing article, 28, which is about basically creating the conditions in the international context where the rights can be fully enjoyed. So those 2, for me, were almost like the guiding paradigms. And then I've always been interested in psychology, so I've been learning and studying that's out of my own pleasures. And there were some very interesting psychologists. The one in particular is called Roberto Assagioli, who wrote about harmony, how to work on harmonizing our internal parts. So I always saw this mirroring between inside and outside. Harmony outside in the world is also linked to our own capacities to.
I love this.
And then the UN Charter is also about international civil service. So that for me meant, okay, if the UN is a center for harmonizing the actions of nations, if I work for the UN as an international civil servant, how do I discharge that duty myself? And of course,
what a great question.
It needs to start from yourself as a human being as well. Sorry, it was a long.
No. I love this idea because so many people look outward at the problem. They don't look inward to start with to think about how they can be in the best possible state or to reflect on themselves so that they can be the best harmonizer or facilitator. Yeah, so where did that lead for you? Asking how to be in harmony or find harmony, or what does that look like in you so that you can then do that externally? It sounds like a bit of a journey.
The journey that is not over yet.
They never are, eh? These internal ones.
There is a process, and that process is a constant harmonizing, is a constant discovery of yourself, and we keep growing, and we keep growing through experiences. So it's a constant way of searching a new balance the more you enrich yourself with experiences, with knowledge, with inspirations, and with, most fundamentally, in intuitions. So it's our capacity to learn more and more who we are, and this is where also meditation can be quite helpful in terms of these inspirations and intuition, but then looking at the same time the outside world and the contribution that it gives yourself. So there is an ongoing process, and the more you grow, you keep finding new balances, new harmonies, and then keep being questioned, and you reach a new stage, and so on. And understanding that you are just one small element into a much larger picture of human beings, but also other kingdoms of natures, which are equally important, even though we tend to forget as human beings.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's so powerful. I'm also, we talked about it a little before, but how your mum and her journey has shaped your thinking.
She was a psychologist. She used to practice for many years. So it's not that she pushed me, but I saw many books around. And so I started reading those things. And I've been always also very much open, especially when I started doing this international work, especially in conflict or post-conflict situations where you are exposed to situations of stress, and no one really was teaching you how to handle those circumstances. So I've been always very carefully, and by careful, not scared, like attentive to understand to the possible extent the impact that the situations I was in were having on me and how I was reacting. And after difficult postings, I always had a few sessions with coaches just to process the experience. Because one of the challenges that in the humanitarian field, especially emergency, we have is almost like a superhero syndrome, where you need to be tough and this and that. In reality, empathy is the most fundamental tool, and you need to have empathy for the people that you are supporting, but also you need to have empathy for yourself, because otherwise you can't really operate properly in those circumstances. And there, I think a big learning for me was also my years of volunteering in the fire services in Italy, where I was lucky to work with people who really helped me in understanding how they were operating in extremely dangerous situations with calm and poise, and working with fear, because I was asking them, but aren't you afraid? And they say, yes, we are. But this is what you can do about it. So I think that these elements are very important.
What did they tell you about how to find that calm and poise in the midst of fear? What was their advice? Or what's your advice from the different missions that you've been on? How do you find that calm, that poise when it matters?
I think that the real secret is really looking for who you are. We're all different. We all have our own modalities and ways of being. I don't think there is a recipe. If you do this, that is gonna happen. It's literally getting to know yourself and how you react to different situations. I think what is important to know is that this is what I've been studying and reading, in our early years, and apparently some studies say that even before we are born, when we are still in the womb, we are experiencing things which have a big impact on who we are going to be. So understanding that there are many automatisms that happens that are totally out of our control. We are not even aware of those. But I think that if you assume that is the case, and you look at yourself and you try to learn about yourself and how you react to situations, you can slowly start detecting and unpacking such automatism. And fear is one of those. Fears is very important because it allows you to be alert to situation. The problem is when it takes over and a number of automatisms kick in, and you're not really behaving in the most efficient or useful way in a situation. So its initial element is a useful alarm, but then you need to, and this is what I learned from these colleagues in the fire services, but also in peacekeeping and other, is this capacity of staying with yourself in those situations, seeing what is your reactions there, taking a step back, and trying to work with your reactions. But it's an individual journey. You can be supported in that, but you really need to embrace who you are. And as I said earlier, you need to accept yourself for what you are and what you are not.
Yes.
Focus on who you are fundamentally. And if I can say something here, because I think it's in connection, I've been reading some interesting stuff about narcissism past few years. And that I thought was quite amazing because apparently, and this is also connected to our topic today, disaster risk reduction, apparently there are incredibly increasing trends in narcissism in our societies, in people and in societies. And we're speaking about almost like pathological narcissism. And some of the characteristics of narcissists is an incredible sense of entitlement, a very poor capacity of assessing risk, almost like a sense of omnipotence, like I can do everything, I have it under control, or proneness to conflict, or very poor capacity to cooperate with others. And some of these studies are pointing to the fact that these pathological characteristics are no longer confined into individuals. They're becoming almost values in our societies, like strong sense of entitlement, everything now, and so on. So if you take that as a fact, and on the other side, you see the incredible increasing in disaster risk trends, the exploitation of the environment, biodiversity, and different species disappearing, the damage to the environment, the climate, and so on. For me, it's hard not to see a correlation between the two. So I think that is very important that we devote much more attention, and I hope the social scientists will help us understand if there is correlations between increasing disaster risk and narcissism, because I think that conflicts, disasters, and other challenges that we have are also the result of this. So we can work on other type of solutions, and we must do that, and I can give you example of when things can be successful. But at the same time, we really need to work on this. And here the role of education is really important. Parental education, formal education, informal education. A lot of it is really focused on competition. And I always find very difficult to understand how you can push people to be competitive and highly specialized, and then at the same time complaining that there is no cooperation or complaining that people work in silos. The two things simply don't get together, right? So we really need a different educational models. We really need to rethink seriously education. And I know that may sound like a platitude, but it's a fact. In many countries, education is not getting the attention, and the curricula are not necessarily up to help people discover who they are and how to behave in a cooperative manner in the world. It starts at school, it starts in the family, then it's a life journey. But I think that aspect of education is really fundamental, because there is an element of education that pushes for narcissism, and that is dangerous. And social media, the spike also, or social media are extremely helpful, but they also be extremely damaging, as we have seen, and different countries are taking different measures now. Narcissism for me is really like a big issue, in correlation with peace and security, in correlation between and with disasters and disaster risk.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense when you look at the climate crisis, how we got here and why we aren't finding our way forward better. And I think, if you look at it too much, which of course working in disasters we do, it can start to feel quite dark because we just can't seem to collectively get it together to tackle an existential issue like this. So I'm just wondering, you work with a lot of countries and climate change and disasters are right up there. How do you keep motivated and positive for moving forward in this kind of situation?
I think, look, we had in October, the government of the Philippines hosted Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction. There were over 5,000 people that came, and even more online. And fascinating to see the motivations, the inspirations, the knowledge and the determination, the passion, the stamina, the resilience, you name it, like an incredible collective of objectives. And that for me is motivating. Because then you realize that, yes, the challenges are big, but in fact, if we work together, we get things done positively. Like, think about early warning systems. This year is the anniversary, the 20th commemoration of the Indian Ocean tsunami. At that time, there was no early warning system fundamentally for tsunamis. 20 years later, we do have it. So, which basically means that when we define a problem and we actually converge on finding solutions, putting resources, putting knowledge, things can get done. And the successful development of the early warning system for tsunami is a very simple example. Now, one can argue, is the system perfect? No, it's not. We know that. There's been a lot of events. I was recently also in Banda Aceh in Indonesia that was badly hit, 170,000, 80,000 people, 180,000 people that died just there, with a trauma that is still very tangible, but at the same time, an incredible stamina by the community, very inspiring, strong determination, willingness to overcome, converge, and prepare for the future. But many also experts coming from different parts of the world. So they were saying that we still have challenges in our early warning system, but at the same time, things are progressing. Now, if we have been successful there, we can also be successful in other things. And that's why also the UN Secretary General has launched a couple of years ago these initiatives of the early warning for all by 2027, basically meaning to ensure coverage to everyone. And here the aspect of inclusion of the everyone is really fundamental, because in many countries systems are extremely weak. So again, early warning systems then are also very helpful because they are helpful not only for getting better prepared for emergencies and allowing people to save lives and save assets, but the knowledge that you generate to have a fully functioning early warning system is also extremely helpful for disaster prevention and disaster risk reductions in the long term. It's also very helpful for economic investment and social development and environmental protection. Yes, the initial knowledge may be applied for having a stronger early warning system, but through the better knowledge of hazard, through a better knowledge of people's and environmental vulnerabilities, you can use that information also for longer term preventative strategies. And this was the big message coming out of the Manila conference, a very clear understanding of what can be done. But it's not only the question of climate. Climate is about the hazards, right? There are economic and social dimensions of disaster risk are very big. And these are the ones where also we can do a lot to change how things are at the moment. But to do that, we need more social sciences engaged, and we need a better understanding of vulnerabilities, a better understanding of intersectionalities, a stronger engagement of different communities. Like inclusion is really a must, and it's not like a tokenist point. Is you need to be inclusive, not as a good gesture. You need to be inclusive simply because the challenges are so big that you need the whole hands on deck. You need everybody experience contribute to find solutions. It's a different way of looking at the question of inclusion for me as fundamentally as a resource.
I'm just thinking how we build a fitness for challenge, and then coming back to what you were saying before, right? It's about how we build a fitness for challenge within ourselves, but then also that fitness together, and then how that then becomes action that we can see in our world. And I am getting a sense, because I started with disasters 20 years ago with that tsunami. So thinking through that 20 years, I am getting a sense that people are more aware of disaster risk and the challenges that our world faces, and are more open to listening and understand that our systems need to change and become fit for purpose for life on the climate frontier and all the other challenges that we're facing. So that if you look over that 20 years since that tsunami, I can see an increased fitness for challenge. I can see some momentum. Are you feeling that too? What was your first disaster?
Myself.
Oh, me too. My career's been a series of them.
No, my first disasters were, I think, the one that I was consciously part of were in the fire services. And some of them can be very small, but for the individuals hit, of course, are massive. Then my first overseas missions was in the Balkans in the 90s. I think, but there was more on the conflict aspect. But even there, it was interesting to see how disasters and conflict do coexist, and the erosions that both have on the resources of the communities. That yes, there has been a great increase in understanding compared to a few years. And I think that there was a great podcast that you have done a few months back with a gentleman. He was nicely explaining disaster risk.
David Lallimore?
Yeah, I think I enjoyed that, and I think he put it very sharply. Where I feel we are at the moment is that we have, thanks to science and technology, very strong and increasingly so understanding of hazards, especially whether they're natural or other type of hazards. But risk is not just the hazard. Risk is also the combinations with exposure and vulnerabilities, meaning people and assets that are in the way of a hazard, and also their inherent vulnerabilities or capacities. Whereas sometimes working on the hazard, especially if it is of a natural nature, is difficult. You cannot mitigate the intensity of a typhoon with a magic wand, but with a stronger action on reducing carbon emissions, then we can. So we can also mitigate, reduce the intensity of certain hazards if we do the climate actions that the science and other practitioners are telling us. But if we move away from the hazard and we look at the knowledge that we have on vulnerabilities and intersectionality, there is much more there that can be learned. But most fundamentally, how you bring together hazard exposure and vulnerabilities. And that is the combination that creates disaster risk. So when you look at these three hazards, then the question is, we have three variables: hazard, vulnerabilities, exposure. And let's add also capacity. Which one can we work on in the short term and medium term? So it's almost effectiveness, a consideration on efficiency and effectiveness. So then you can work on reducing vulnerabilities, you can work on strengthening capacities, you can work on limiting exposure. So these are the things that we can do. And they do require also, of course, political leadership. But I can say with a certain degree of confidence that sometimes it's hard for political leaders to take the decisions if people don't ask for it. So my dream is in a future election to have candidate questions by people say, what are you doing to prevent disaster risk? So people need to demand it. And this is where education, the work that you are doing is very important because it needs to come to that point where people demand for prevention is stronger. Because if you are a politician, so if you are a mayor, and you have on your hand a strong demand for prevention, but then, of course, you need to strengthen the local hospital, you need to build certain roads, there are certain immediate needs that may be seen, they're not, but they may be seen at odds with longer-term prevention. So how to combine the two, the political leaders, they need the strong demand and backing by people. So we as individuals, we as community, we must demand so that when somebody run for office, in addition to the different things that they normally say, we say, and for prevention, I'm going to do this, this, and that. So this is our longer term goal. But also where education is important. And the work that we can do with schools and on disaster risk reduction. This year, there is a lot of focus on safe schools. And it's not just about the resilience of building, it's also the service that education is about children, is about teachers, is about the families, is about the content, the curricula, and so on.
And I think a lot of the people that we work with now, they're in a state of polycrisis. You've just got this cumulative impact. Yeah, it's fire, then it's drought, then it's flood, then it's COVID, then it's, and I think this is helping to build some momentum or some immediacy that I'm hopeful about, because people have a stake in this in their everyday lives in a way they didn't some years ago. So I'm hoping that translates into this political leadership and action that we need. I'm hopeful anyway. Let's see, but
we need to demand it. Let me be a bit provocative. I've seen a few days ago that there was an agreement to issue defense bonds in among some of the European countries. That, for me personally, is an alarm bell. Because basically we're asking people to put money and invest into increasing armaments. I understand the logic, I understand the politics of that, I understand all this, but if I look at the challenges that we have been discussing in terms of creating sustainable development goals bonds, climate bonds, disaster risk reduction bonds, and the years of discussion, and then for defense bond, it get done so quickly, which is great in the sense that clearly when things are wanted, they can get done quickly. So I hope that the same political will and determinations is applied also to issue resilience bonds and put money behind them. Because as we ask people to pay for armaments, I think we should ask people to contribute to resilience. And that is also politically speaking a very tricky. I know I'm entering into a field which is contentious, but I feel I want to say that because we need to invest much more in prevention and resilience. And that is the core of that Article 1 of the United Nations Charter. And the UN, and I really want to say that very clearly, the United Nations Charter is a fundamental paradigm change in UN history, where we had for millennia a peace paradigm based on the use of force. And in the UN Charter, that gets changed into a peace paradigm based on international cooperation for development. It's not small, it's big. I still believe that we are still understanding what that is. This is part of these great intuitions that took place in those negotiating moments. It's the result of a lot of work, I'm sure, by people in those days. But we should not lose sight. So the old saying that if you want peace, you need to prepare for war, that reigned for millennia, the UN Charter tried to turn page, and I think that we still need to invest on that, and we're not doing it convincingly as much as we should.
And coming back to your point around education, I think there are just not enough people reading that page, that is the UN Charter, or knowing about it or understanding it and what it means for our world. And I also think you're right to provoke. I think now is the time to do that. And previous podcast guest, Dan Neely, he talks about provoking with love, where your heart, your good heart is your intent behind your provocation. And I just thought it really is the time to provoke, but to do it with love, to do it with that really good intent, to do it with the intent of harmonizing and taking us to a new place. Because, there's a saying in New Zealand sometimes we use, it's called too much hui and not enough doing. And that means too much meeting and not enough doing. And I think we need to move from the talking about it to the doing, but that also requires education, like you say. It requires resource, it requires investment, it requires political will to get us there. And there is that role of provocation and provoking and demanding to get us there, I think.
Yeah, and we tend to confine politics normally to politicians and to some expert. In reality, that is not the case. It's about us, it's about people. I recognize the challenges that may exist in different contexts and situations and countries, and that's what we need to keep working for. But that demand from people remains fundamental for disaster risk reduction, because the impact that disasters are having on societies. In Banda Aceh, I was deeply moved. At some point, someone showed the drawing, I think it was children, that said that lives lost to disasters are wasted lives. If you think about it, that is very powerful. They're wasted life, and then the speaker was saying that sometimes people fight and die for a cause. They had a cause, they had a purpose. People that die in disasters, they die, they're wasted. And I was deeply moved by that concept, and I thought that drawing was sending a very powerful message, because the people that dies in disaster, if you think about the skills that they had, the contribution that they could have made to their societies, and so on and so forth, it's really, if I can look at it coldly, it's really resources lost that would have been helpful instead in keep building the resilience of our communities and societies and nations. And the damage are great, and so as people we really need to demand more. But that is not enough.
Yeah, I was just feeling that. Yeah, it is moving. And we often talk about the death toll when we count the number of deaths, but we don't really think about the impact of what that death toll, the toll that we're all carrying, is, and whether that is the psychological impacts of those deaths and those injuries on that family, on that society, and that lost possibility of those people. So I think that the death toll from any disaster is something that we all carry, but we don't think about it quite that way. Yeah, that's what came to mind. I'm thinking for our last question in this, Marco, is there a question in an interview or a panel discussion that you've never been asked, but you'd just love to answer? What is your magic question that nobody has hit on yet that you would just love to answer?
Maybe is a question that came up in Manila, and is if there is a correlation between disaster risk reduction and human rights. and the strengthening of the legal foundations of disaster risk reductions. Again, it sounds a bit nerdy, but I think is a very powerful one.
Nerdy is welcome here. I love to geek out.
Because looking at things in a very pragmatic way, it's hard not to argue that behind any situation of vulnerability, if not even exposure, there is a limited enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So we can use the human rights paradigms, international law, and also in the domestic field to strengthen the work on disaster risk reduction. So disaster risk reduction is instrumental to the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedom, to the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedom. And at the same time, working on those does help reducing and managing disaster risk. And is a very powerful correlations, because if you look at simply the question of lack of equality or discrimination or the exclusion that is affecting persons with disabilities or certain communities or the inequality between men and women, all of that is not just a right issue, is also having a strong impact on vulnerability and exposure and increasing disaster risk trend, and what can or cannot be done to reduce disaster risk and what must be done. So working and using the human rights paradigm does strengthen action for disaster risk reduction. And on the question of the legal foundations, in fact, I'm very thrilled by the decision of the United Nations General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago to finally move forward with the development of an international agreement for the protection of persons in the event of disasters, which has a strong component on prevention. This is a fundamental piece. In a way, one can argue that still creating disaster risk is legal. You are liable if something happens. The action of creating risk is okay. So we need to develop legislations that is actually looking at making the creation of disaster risk is illegal. And then, of course, it's not that black and white. There's a lot of nuances around it. But fundamentally, we need to work on defining a legal obligation to reduce disaster risk domestically and internationally, because it's a major void. And unless you have it, and the fact is that whereas in 2015 we agreed in Sendai to reduce disaster risk and losses, the projections are that by 2030 they will have increased by 40%. So instead of decreasing, we are increasing. So this is where we need strong legislation, and that where we need a legal obligation to reduce disaster risk. And in domestic systems, that is not really the case yet. We need to work harder to make it happen. Because it is about protecting people's rights, but it's using their competence, the competence and the knowledge of persons with disabilities, the competence and the knowledge of women, the competence and the knowledge of indigenous communities, of children and youth. It is necessary to have effective. So it's an issue of efficiency and effectiveness. So I think that the human rights paradigm can help in that context, because the fundamental message for today is that we must do more for prevention. Disasters are not natural. They are a human, socioeconomic, and political construct. We need to invest in prevention.
Absolutely. Oh, I think that is such a strong point for us to finish on. And Marco, I can't thank you enough. Every time I talk to you, I feel like I'm leaving the island and connecting with the world. That's how I feel. And it's just the best thing. And now I'm really chuffed that our audience can experience that with you too.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's been really a big pleasure for me. Thank you for having me. And this is my first podcast.
Oh, you're a pro. The first of many, I think.
As we were saying earlier, inspirations comes from interactions.
Yes.
So it's the conversation that you have with people, like the one that we had today, that brings inspirations to you, but it brings it also to me, because your questions make me think through what I have to do better. It's always great to speak with you. Let's do more.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening. A little reminder that if you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out and subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Even better, share it with someone in your network who might find it interesting. This podcast is produced by Disastrous. You can find more information at disastrous.co and join our newsletter for resources from this episode. Stay tuned for another Disrupting Disasters.